this week with, as part of our Special Places celebration. We're tapping into people who work in allied fields who can help to explain how the conservation work and land protection work that the West Virginia Land Trust does relates to the work that they do. As we've said before, we do conservation with a purpose, and we're looking to find ways that land protection can be inserted into the economic future and the community well-being of West Virginia. Tonight, I'm really pleased that we have Evan Hansen, who is president of Downstream Strategies, an environmental consulting firm that's based in Morgantown. And Evan not only is an environmental consultant, he also is an expert on water quality. And he also is an elected representative to the West Virginia House of Delegates. So Evan Hansen, we're really glad you could be here this evening, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, it's nice to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. I know that you've been doing a lot of, you do a lot of interviews and live broadcasts, and you're bringing issues to the public on a regular basis. But I'd like for folks who maybe don't know you to understand a little bit about your background and what brought you up to where you are now. What was your initial training, and how did you first get into environmental work?
Well, I started doing environmental work after I got a degree in computer science and worked for an environmental consulting nonprofit for 7 years. But then I went back to school and got a degree in what's called energy and resources, which is an interdisciplinary environmental science public policy program at UC Berkeley. And then started up Downstream Strategies after that, and that was 23 years ago. So for the last 23 years, I've been working in West Virginia and across Appalachia and across the country on issues related to water and energy, science, and policy.
When you moved here, did you know that water would be such a critical issue for West Virginia?
No, I had no idea, but there was a lot of work to do, and I guess there will continue to be a lot of work to do related to water here.
Okay, and Downstream Strategies has really grown. I mean, I guess it still qualifies as a small business, but it seems to me that it's a business that has really expanded. What's the size of your staff and your locations, and the nature of the work that the business does?
Well, for the first 10 years or so, it was just me, but then we staffed up, and we have 15 employees now. Most of us work out of the Morgantown office, but we also have an office in Davis, in Canadian Valley, but also a second satellite office in Lewisburg. Mm-hmm. And in terms of clients now, it's pretty diverse. We get hired by government agencies at the federal, state, and local levels. We get hired by nonprofit organizations, which is really who I started working for 20 years ago, mostly nonprofits. And we do a lot of work for individuals and attorneys and private businesses as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I know that the Land Trust has worked a good bit with Downstream Strategies. When we're evaluating lands and trying to determine whether we should be protecting them, we need to know if they have any environmental liabilities. And Downstream is one of our go-to organizations that we turn to help us evaluate properties prior to their conservation. So you've got a great staff. They're very responsive, and they've always really given us real good, complete information. We really appreciate that. Tell me a little bit about how you then made your shift or expanded your purview in the world of water to decide to run for an elected office. I mean, what person would choose to do that, Evan?
Well, I never had aspirations to run for office. But like I mentioned before, a lot of our projects are related to both science and policy. And I found that from time to time, I was invited to provide testimony before legislative committees at the Capitol in Charleston. And then that kind of culminated in providing a lot of testimony in 2014 after the chemical leak in the Elk River that contaminated the water supply for a few 100,000 West Virginians. And I spent a lot of time working with members of the legislature through that session, and a really good bill passed unanimously to better protect our drinking water across the state. And that got me kind of intrigued by the possibility of running, because I started to get to know some of the legislators a little better. And then what happened after that session was that over the next couple of years, that law got chipped away at little by little. And that made me think that, actually I'm not too happy about that. And there were some of my local representatives that were voting to chip away at it. And I thought, why not give it a try? We need more people to run. And so I gave it a try.
Okay. When you were doing that work after the Elk River spill and you were going back and forth to Charleston, were you hired to do that?
I had a project in place with the West Virginia Rivers Coalition to do some policy relevant scientific and policy analysis. And we had a contract in place to do some of that work through the course of 2014. But the chemical leak happened in January, right? It was January 9th, 2014. So what we decided right after the leak was to just go ahead and focus on that and to do some research and put a report out as quickly as we could, because we knew the legislature was in session. We knew they were scrambling to try to identify what went wrong and what they could do to make sure that wouldn't happen in the future. So yeah, I was hired to at least do that analysis and report.
Mm-hmm. And then you got the political bug with all that time in Charleston.
I got the bug, yeah.
As you know, I mean, well, I don't know if all of our listeners do or our supporters, but water quality is a real top priority for the West Virginia Land Trust, and so is water quantity. Our view is that if you can protect land that's riverside or streamside and make sure that it's forested, then that water will be filtered and inputs like pollutants will be reduced and sediment will be reduced. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of land conservation and the effect that you see that it can have on water quality and quantity in West Virginia?
Yeah, well, it's definitely an important component of keeping water clean and keeping drinking water clean. One of the reasons is just what you mentioned, that if you could protect the riparian areas alongside the streams, that can filter pollutants out when it rains and the water washes into the streams. And that's there's no real controversy about that. That's pretty well known. So especially protecting riparian areas is very important. But then a second benefit of land protection is to make sure that certain types of development don't happen in the most sensitive areas that could contaminate our drinking water systems. So you can think about what happened in the Elk River with the water crisis, where there was an above ground storage tank farm with these very large tanks that were storing toxic substances, and they were right on the edge of the Elk River, meaning that if things went wrong, like they did go wrong, those toxic pollutants would leak directly into the stream and find their way to the intake pretty quickly, very quickly. And that's what happened. But if that riparian area were protected from that type of development, then contamination wouldn't have occurred.
Why do you think that clean drinking water seems not to be widely embraced? Why isn't it a given that clean drinking water is something that everyone needs?
I think it's widely embraced among the people of West Virginia. I just think that there are some interest groups and therefore some elected officials who choose not to vote to protect drinking water. But according to polling I've seen, it's one of the highest polling issues across the state. So I think people really do care about it, as you would imagine that they would.
Well, and I think sometimes that it seems like there is this false choice that is made between people saying, oh, well, sure, we want clean drinking water, but we need to look out for business, or we need to be a little bit lax about some of our standards. And yet it strikes me that clean drinking water and clean water in general is really important for business and really important for economic vitality.
Absolutely. I mean, people don't want to live in a place that doesn't have clean drinking water. People want to keep their families healthy and safe. but also it's just one of those basic types of infrastructure that's expected if you're going to site a business somewhere. You know, we need good roads and we need broadband internet, but we also need clean drinking water, and we need to be sure that we're going to have clean drinking water.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just something that we don't see all across West Virginia. We've got issues still.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It strikes me sometimes that when people talk about, oh, we need to attract businesses or we need to retain people, there are quality of life issues that make clean water especially important. It's a pretty competitive environment out there, and communities all across the nation are competing to have businesses move there and to bring in talent. And if you can't offer a basic amenity such as clean water, then you're not going to be competitive at attracting some of those economic activities you'd like to bring in.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think, unfortunately, part of the repercussions from the 2014 chemical leak is people who don't know the geography of West Virginia that well, they just assume that it impacted the entire state. It did impact quite a large proportion of our population, but as you know, it wasn't the entire state. It didn't impact our area.
Right. Okay. I think that one of the things that maybe some people don't really understand is where their drinking water comes from.
Yep, a lot of people don't. And so drinking water comes either from a river or from groundwater. And that's, you know, a lot of people in West Virginia have private wells, especially in more rural areas. But then those of us who are on public water, it could come from surface water or groundwater or some combination of the two. So in Morgantown, for example, all the water that comes from Morgantown Utility Board, that's from either the Mon River or from a tributary called Coben Creek.
Mm-hmm. I think when people find out that their water comes from a river, suddenly they're a lot more concerned about that river. But I think that there are other standards too, just in terms of not necessarily drinking water, but clean water that makes it swimmable. There are other activities too that play into that. Do you know how our water quality compares to other states?
Well, I think different states have different issues with water quality. And in West Virginia, the big issues are erosion and sedimentation. So basically mud or dirt washing into the rivers from construction activities or dirt roads or other types of activities. So that's number one. Number two would be bacteria from untreated human waste. Unfortunately, in some parts of the state, especially in the more rural areas, there's still a lot of untreated waste that goes right into the rivers and streams. And then a third issue, which is more regional in West Virginia, is acid mine drainage largely from old abandoned coal mines. And, you know, that's high levels of metals and low pH, which basically kills the aquatic life. So all those things have impacts for recreation. You know, if you're killing the aquatic life, you're not going to have a fishery. No one's going to be able to go fishing there. If you have high levels of bacteria, it makes it unsafe to swim, because if you drink that water, it splashes in your mouth or gets into a cut on your leg, you know, you're going to get sick.
Yeah. I think that we are really lucky. You mentioned earlier West Virginia Rivers Coalition, and I think that we should give a shout out to them for their advocacy for clean water throughout West Virginia. We're really fortunate that they are there, and some great watershed associations around the state, many of which the West Virginia Land Trust partners with. So I think we're really fortunate to have that. And one of the programs that was promoted a couple of years ago that I think was pretty compelling is thinking of West Virginia as the birthplace of rivers. Mm-hmm. And that starts to relate to the perception that rivers start here and clean water comes from the mountains. Can you talk about birthplace of rivers and the issue of water quantity as well, getting beyond the issue of water quality?
West Virginia is a headwater state. I mean, we're the headwaters for many different rivers, that the headwaters of which start in Pocahontas County or other parts of the mountains of West Virginia. and radiate out. So we've got rivers flowing toward the Chesapeake Bay, or we have those rivers that flow north up through Morgantown up to Pittsburgh and form the Ohio River, and then there's rivers flowing south as well. So we have these rivers kind of radiating out from all the highest points in West Virginia. What was the second part of your question?
Well, it's about what do you see looking ahead, and what kind of concerns do you think exist with water quantity that maybe you're not thinking about a whole lot?
Yeah, so quality and quantity are tightly linked, but a little bit different. And West Virginia has typically not had an issue with having too little water. We have a lot of water. So unlike the arid parts of the country where their primary issue is quantity, ours has typically been quality. But things are changing now with climate change. And what the climate models have predicted is exactly what we're seeing in West Virginia, which is that the precipitation is coming in faster flashes. So we're getting more rain in a shorter period of time. And the best example of that recently was in 2016, where we had like 1,000-year rainfall event, which created those catastrophic floods that killed 23 people and destroyed whole communities and homes and businesses. And many of those homes haven't even been rebuilt yet, even though that flood happened 4 years ago. So we're seeing what the climate models have projected, which is more flooding. But what that also means is that in between the flooding, the rivers have generally less flow in them. So we have about the same amount of water over the course of the year, but it's coming in faster flushes.
And are there particular responses that you think we should be implementing? What are some of the solutions in order to address that changing water regime or changing precipitation regime?
Well, it's a challenge in West Virginia that we need to stop building in the floodplains, for one thing, because those places are likely to get flooded more and more frequently in the future with climate change. So that's one thing that we need to really pay careful attention to. Unfortunately, in some parts of the state, there's not much land to build on other than in the floodplain. So it's a real challenge here. But the other thing we need to do is do our part to address climate change. And West Virginia has a special role to play in terms of addressing climate change because our economy has been so closely tied to coal mining for so many years. And burning coal is one of the primary causes of climate change across the globe. One thing we can do, and one thing we have done at the legislature is pass some laws that finally allow the development of renewable energy, particularly solar development in West Virginia. That's something that allows us to diversify our energy mix, but at the same time generate hundreds, if not thousands, of jobs. And these are jobs that have been going to other states, but have been passing by West Virginia. And so that's something that I'm pretty proud to have played a significant role in getting through the legislature last session.
Is there anything that you think will be introduced in the upcoming session in January or February in the state legislature that is going to relate to water quality or quantity that people should be aware of?
Well, in terms of water quality, I did introduce a bill last session that was called the Clean Drinking Water Act of 2020, and that focused on those forever chemicals, like the PFAS chemicals that were the subject of that Dark Waters movie. And people who grew up where you grew up in the Parkersburg area know all too well that a lot of those chemicals were dumped in the river, even though the company that was using them knew that they were toxic and harming people. And now there's 6 public water systems in the Parkersburg area that are having to treat their water in a special way, and it's being funded by DuPont as part of the legal settlement. So that bill is trying to get a handle on where these forever chemicals are being discharged across the state of West Virginia, and then to create an enforceable standard to basically hold the polluters accountable, because that's who should pay to clean these up, is the companies that caused the pollution in the first place. we shouldn't we shouldn't require the water utilities to spend extra on treating pollution that they didn't cause.
Mhm. One of the additional issues that I think sometimes comes up is stormwater control, and places where stormwater is not separated from sanitary sewers. And is that a widespread issue throughout the state?
Yeah, it is. There's a lot of communities that built combined stormwater and sanitary sewer systems. Morgantown is one example. And it's not just West Virginia. It was common all across the northeastern United States. And that's a tricky issue because what happens is when it rains, there's so much stormwater that goes into the system that it causes the pipes to overflow. And what overflows is a combination of the stormwater and the sanitary wastewater, which is, what comes out when you flush your toilet. So when you combine the relatively clean water with the relatively dirty water, you get dirty water. So basically you get dirty water that comes directly out into the rivers and streams. And it's very expensive to clean up and to redo all the piping, but communities are in the process of doing that, but it's a many decade proposition to get that done.
Yeah. All right. Well, Evan, I really appreciate all the work that you do on our behalf. And I don't know if there's any particular take-home message that you would like for folks to depart with after hearing about some of the things that you see as really critical in West Virginia. Are there 2 or 3 key essential points that you think folks should keep in mind if they have concerns about their clean water?
Well, one thing I would say is that these issues come up at the legislature every session. There's good bills like the one I described, and then there's sort of like defense that's being played all the time because there are always attempts to chip away at water protections. And so, one piece of advice is to pay attention to what's going on and to make sure legislators hear from you. And the best source of information for that, I think, is the West Virginia Rivers Coalition because they track these issues closely. But I would also say supporting organizations like the Land Trust is really important because you guys have done such incredible work, especially over the last decade or so as things have ramped up. I think the legacy of land protection, not just to protect water quality, but to protect other characteristics of the land that are also very important. I mean, once you look back, if we look back 20, 30, 40 years from now and see what happened over this last decade, it's going to be quite a legacy. So I think supporting groups like the Land Trust is really essential.
That was a really great unpaid advertisement. I have to thank you for that. Evan, have you served on the board of directors of nonprofit organizations in the state?
Yes.
Which ones?
Well, I served on the board of Friends of Deckers Creek, which is one of the local watershed associations in the Morgantown area. I serve on the board of Canaan Valley Institute now and Appalachian Headwaters. And I'm also on the board of some non-environmental groups like the Morgantown Rotary and the Mon County Read Lab.
Mm-hmm. Well, as someone who works at a nonprofit organization, I'm really mindful of the importance of good boards of directors who really guide organizations. And as if you didn't have enough to do with your own business and your legislative efforts, and here you're giving time to nonprofit organizations too. We're really grateful for all that you do to try to make West Virginia a better place. Thank you for that. I would like to highlight that there are a couple of other videos that have been posted on our website that I hope folks will take a look at. One is our board member, Dave Clark, who has a real brief feature about why he serves and certainly links the West Virginia Land Trust conservation work to economic development. And another one is also about water quality, which was put together a couple of years ago. Features Evan and Angie Rosser from West Virginia Rivers Coalition, Gary Birdie from Trout Unlimited, and I hope folks will take a look at those and realize the different ways that organizations and people are working for improved water quality throughout the state. So, Evan, thanks so much for joining us, and good luck with all the many different endeavors that you have.
Thanks. I appreciate having me on.
All right. Take care.